Ever since I started watching college football, it feels like the Oregon Ducks have been pretty good. I remember watching Dennis Dixon when I was just a little kid. I remember when they made the playoff in 2014. I remember when they were really good in 2018. And I remember the last couple of years when Oregon has been near the top. Except there was one year nestled between all these different good seasons that was absolutely awful. There was a time in recent memory when Oregon was terrible at football. The team went 4-8, they were a mess, had to find a new coach, and things were not exactly working out for them. In today's video, I want to talk about that. We're going to go back in time and talk about the last time Oregon was not good at football. We're going to revisit that 2016 season, all the chaos that happened with Oregon, and what ultimately happened afterwards. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about that time Oregon was terrible at football. So in order to understand the 2016 season, we first need to go back in time. Let's talk about 2015. Even though they lost Marcus Mariota to the NFL, 2015 was a great season for Oregon. They had insane talent across the entire offensive side of the football, as they replaced Marcus Mariota with Vernon Adams from Eastern Washington. At one point, he was the best quarterback in the FCS, and the receiver room was also stacked. They had guys like Byron Marshall, Devin Allen, and Braylon Addison, alongside future NFL tight ends Jake Breeland, Johnny Mundt, and Pharaoh Brown. Their defense was stacked too, with guys like DeForest Buckner and Ugo Amadi. They also had one of the better young coaches in the country in Mark Helfrich, who was in his third season with the Ducks. The offense was led by Scott Frost as the offensive coordinator, and they utilized the same option style of offense that they had used with Marcus, and it worked really well with Adams. He ended up throwing for 2,600 yards with 26 touchdowns and 6 picks, and 2 rushing touchdowns. The real star of the offense was their sophomore running back, Royce Freeman. He put up 1,836 rushing yards and 17 total touchdowns. The Ducks would end up going 9-3 in the regular season, with wins over USC and Oregon State. But they also lost a few head-scratchers. They had a 42-point loss to Utah and a 1-score loss to Washington State. Even at 9-3, there were some thoughts that they may be fraudulent, considering a handful of their losses were by pretty close margins due to their defense allowing a lot of points. They let Eastern Washington score 41 on them, they beat a 7-6 Washington team by 6, a 6-7 Arizona State team by 5, and an Oregon State team that only won 2 games by just 10. On the other hand, they barely lost to Michigan State, who ended up making the playoff. They beat an 11-1 Stanford team, and then in the last game of the season, they had that wild Fiesta Bowl matchup against TCU that went into triple overtime, and TCU came back from behind to steal a huge win. So yeah, that was 2015. Now let's get closer to the preseason hype, the roster, the expectations for 2016. I mean, Oregon was expected to be good. After coming off 9 wins the previous year, there was a lot of hype for 2016. Mark Helfrich was once again retained as the head coach, but Scott Frost would leave to take the head coaching job at UCF. Oregon would replace him with a receivers coach and would promote him to OC. They ended up going back to the FCS grad transfer world to get a quarterback and got Dakota Prukop from Montana State. Like Vernon Adams, he was one of the top FCS quarterbacks over the previous few years, and at Montana State, he'd thrown for over 5,500 yards and 46 touchdowns to just 16 picks. He also had 2 consecutive years of almost 1,000 yards rushing, and he was a mobile quarterback. He was the perfect fit for the Ducks offense, but he wasn't the only new quarterback on the team. They had just signed a local 3-star recruit by the name of Justin Herbert, and he really was going under the radar. Most of their contributors from last year were also coming back, like Royce Freeman was back for his final season, and then the entire offensive line and tight end room as well. They did lose DeForest Buckner to the draft, but they had a couple of guys to replace him. In terms of the season itself, Oregon started the year ranked 24th in the country, with some questions about whether or not they'd be able to overcome their losses at defense and at receiver. With some excitement around Dakota Prukop and how the ceiling was for the offense, expectations were still pretty high. In week 1, they'd play against UC Davis, and they scored 53 points and put them away after the third quarter. In week 2, they faced the Virginia Cavaliers, who'd end up finishing the year at 2-10. Oregon won by over 3 touchdowns, and Prukop looked like a Heisman contender with 3 touchdown passes. Sadly though, that would all fall apart the next week. They'd go into Lincoln, Nebraska, and actually lose to the Huskers 35-32. The offense struggled to get going at all through the air, and despite 2 Ducks rushing for over 100 yards, they still ended up losing. After that, they dropped another game by 3 points against Colorado the following week, and the shine had started to come off of Dakota Prukop. The running game was working exceptionally behind guys like Royce Freeman and Tony Brooks-James, but the passing game was not working. They dropped to 2-3 the week after, as they lost to Washington State 51-33. In this game, Prukop just threw for 132 points and an interception, while Royce Freeman ran for 140 yards and 3 touchdowns. He was doing his part. After the Wazoo game, Prukop was benched and was replaced by Justin Herbert. That was the problem though, because the next game came against the 5th-ranked Washington Huskies, who ended up putting up 70 points on the Ducks and their poor true freshman quarterback Herbert. By this point, Oregon was 2-4 and hadn't won a conference game yet. They wouldn't get one the next week, as they ended up losing 52-49 to the Cal Golden Bears, who at the time were led by Davis Webb, who threw for 5 touchdowns against that Ducks defense. Herbert would end up throwing 6 touchdowns in that game in a losing effort, and it was apparent that he had won the starting quarterback job and taken it away from Prukop and was the future, but the season was a wash. The Ducks would then return to Autzen Stadium the next week and win their first conference game of the season against Arizona State. That team ended up finishing at 5-7, and thanks to 400 passing yards and 4 touchdowns from Justin Herbert, they ended up winning that game. They then would finish the season with big losses to USC and Stanford, and then had a 2-point victory over the Utah Utes before they lost a heartbreaker to a 3-8 Oregon State team in the Civil War, letting the Beavers score 13 unanswered points to seal the game in the 4th quarter. Oregon would finish the season at 4-8 with a 2-7 conference record, good for last place in the Northern Division. So what was the fallout from 2016? Oregon had started the year with a Heisman candidate at quarterback in Dakota Prukop and gave up on him pretty quickly for a future Heisman candidate, Justin Herbert. He was just a 3-star kid who was local, who was never supposed to really do much, but he ended up being a huge deal for them. In 9 total games, Herbert threw for 19 touchdowns and just 4 interceptions, with nearly 2,000 yards. He got the offense rolling much better than Prukop did, and despite Dakota putting up better stats in less games, the receivers did not help much. Oregon's leading receiver in 2016 was Darren Carrington, who just had 606 yards with 5 scores, and the next guy was Charles Nelson, who was a utility player who also returned kicks and played defense. He had 554 yards. The rushing game was definitely not a problem for the Ducks, as Royce Freeman ended up having 945 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns, and Tony Brooks-James, Kenai Benoit, and Taj Griffin also did pretty well. Brooks-James had 771 yards and 9 scores, Benoit had 300 yards and 3 scores, and Griffin had 183 yards. Defensively though, the Ducks were a complete and utter mess. They had the 3rd worst defense in the entire country when it came to points allowed, and they would allow a disastrous 41.4 points per game. For reference, their offense just scored over 35. Their leading tackler was a freshman linebacker by the name of Troy Dye, who had 91 tackles and also led the team in sacks with 6. Brendan Schooler led them in interceptions with just 4, and nobody else on the team in any more than 1. Of course, a season like this was a total embarrassment for the Ducks, and they decided to move on from head coach Mark Helfrich. Their AD, Rob Mullen, said, quote, "No one wanted Mark to be more successful at Oregon than me, but for the past several months, I've grown concerned over the direction of the program. We were not competitive in a number of games, and we were on a poor trajectory." Helfrich was a player favorite as a coach and finished his time in Eugene with a record of 37-16 with 1 playoff appearance. But it was clear that something was not working with him as head man, and the Ducks needed to go elsewhere. Ultimately, they would hire Willie Taggart to be the head coach in 2017, and after just 1 year there, he would jump ship to Florida State, and they would promote offensive line coach Mario Cristobal as their head coach after a 7-5 season. While Taggart ended up failing at Florida State, Cristobal was somewhat successful at Oregon. He compiled a 35-13 record as their head man, and then ended up having a controversial departure to Miami in 2021. To replace him, Oregon signed Georgia defensive coordinator Dan Lanning, who looks to lead the Ducks into the future into the Big Ten, after turning down possibilities to interview with the Alabama job post-Saban. After 2016, Oregon as a program has come back to levels we'd expect of them. They've gone 64-24 with 2 Pac-12 titles, 4 Pac-12 North Division titles, and 4 bowl victories. They haven't won less than 9 games since 2018, if you don't count the weird COVID season where they went 4-3. Justin Herbert ended up becoming a first-round pick and has since become the franchise quarterback of the Chargers, and it is kind of sad though. Given the death of the Pac-12 and its weird future Big Ten conference that Oregon now finds itself in, it's hard to tell where they're going to go from here. They have big games against Ohio State and Michigan this upcoming season, and Coach Lanning has the Ducks humming and ready for their first appearance in the college football playoffs since 2014, hopefully. We'll see if the Ducks are finally ready to take flight this year, as Dylan Gabriel is their quarterback. They return Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson, have a really exciting running back in Jordan James, and also have a pretty stout defense. Lanning's also a great coach, and it looks like the future's great. But yeah, there was a point when Oregon sucked. 2016 was terrible, Dakota Prukop was a bust, the defense was awful, and at one point things were a mess. Even though that was 8 years ago, it feels like just yesterday. But what do you guys think? If you're an Oregon fan, what the heck happened that season? And if you're a fan of another school, should I do a video like this on one of your team's seasons? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.